Growing up in Springfield, Ohio, I was always the dependable one, the person my family could count on. You know the type, responsible, reliable, the one who kept everything together. At first, I didn't mind stepping up. In fact, I took pride in it, but over time it became exhausting, especially since my younger brother Brian, 4 years my junior, coasted through life as the family's golden boy. Brian was effortlessly charming, with a natural ability to win people over with his humor and easygoing nature. My mom, Sharon, practically idolized him. It didn't matter if he broke a promise, let someone down, or made life harder for everyone else. She always had an excuse. "He's just wired differently, Maggie," she'd say dismissively, brushing off whatever mess he'd left behind. "Don't let it bother you." But it did bother me. How could it not, when Brian could seemingly do no wrong in her eyes? Any mistake he made was treated as an innocent quirk. Meanwhile, I was held to a completely different standard. Whenever I brought up how unfair it felt, Mom's go-to response was always the same. "Be the bigger person, Maggie." That phrase became her solution to everything. If Brian ruined a school project when we were kids, I was told to forgive him because he was just a child. Years later, when he let slip about a private job interview I'd been preparing for, it was the same refrain. "Don't let it get to you. You're better than that." For years, I swallowed my frustration and accepted my role. I convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than holding Brian accountable. But every time he shirked responsibility or humiliated me, and every time Mom enabled him, a small part of me grew resentful toward both of them. The breaking point came a couple of weeks ago at a family dinner. It started like any other meal, with casual conversations about work, local news, and harmless jokes. But then, Brian decided to single me out. "Maggie, you know you overthink everything, right?" he said, leaning back in his chair with a grin. His tone was light, but his voice carried across the room, and everyone turned to look at me. My cheeks burned with embarrassment. I wanted to snap back, to call him out for using me as the butt of yet another joke. But years of being conditioned to stay quiet held me back. Forcing a smile, I bit my tongue. As usual, Mom laughed it off. "Oh, Brian, stop teasing your sister," she said lightly. Then, turning to me, she added, "Maggie, don't let him get under your skin." There it was again. Let it go. Be the bigger person. The same refrain I'd heard all my life. But this time, something felt different. It wasn't the first time Brian had embarrassed me, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. He had a way of pushing boundaries and then playing the victim when anyone dared to call him out. Sitting there, memories of past incidents started flooding back. I thought about the time in 7th grade when I spent weeks working on a science project, a miniature weather station I was so proud of, only for Brian to destroy it in a moment of boredom. When I screamed at him, he laughed. Mom came in, saw the wreckage, and instead of holding him accountable, hugged him and told me to let it go. Or the time he casually mentioned my job interview in front of the entire family, making comments about how nervous I was. I didn't get the job, and I couldn't help but wonder if his remarks had planted doubts in the interviewer's mind. He never apologized, of course, and it wasn't just about me. Brian had a long history of dodging responsibilities. If Dad needed help fixing something, Brian would mysteriously disappear. If there was a birthday to celebrate, Brian conveniently had other plans. It was always left to me or someone else to pick up the slack. Yet, in Mom's eyes, he could do no wrong. "Brian's just different," she'd say, as if that excused everything. That night, as I stared at Brian's smug grin across the dinner table, something inside me snapped. I realized I was done being the bigger person. I was tired of sacrificing my pride for the sake of family unity. I was done letting Brian get away with everything, while Mom defended him at every turn. For years, I'd convinced myself that avoiding conflict made me mature, responsible, even noble. But I finally saw it for what it was. A way to keep Brian comfortable, no matter how much it hurt the rest of us. After that dinner, I left determined to make a change. I didn't know exactly what that would look like, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let Brian walk all over me anymore, and I wasn't going to let Mom guilt me into silence. For the first time, I was ready to stand up for myself. The weight of everything Brian had done over the years stayed with me the next day. It wasn't just about his comment at dinner. It was the years of disrespect, irresponsibility, and thoughtless remarks. Every insult, every missed obligation, every joke at my expense came rushing back. I spent the next morning pacing my apartment, replaying all the times Brian had crossed the line. He had always been good at disguising his jabs as jokes, but they weren't harmless. They were calculated, small digs meant to humiliate me, knowing I wouldn't fight back. I thought about the science project he'd ruined, and how I'd worked on it for weeks, carefully assembling the weather station. The night before it was due, he came into my room looking for attention and knocked it off the desk, shattering everything. When I screamed, he laughed, and Mom rushed in, not to scold him, but to comfort him. "He didn't mean it, Maggie," she said. "Don't make a big deal out of this." I was 12 years old, and even then, I learned the lesson I'd been taught my whole life. Let it go. Be the bigger person. As an adult, the stakes only got higher. A few years ago, when I had an important interview for a marketing job in Columbus, I only told Mom about it. I should have known better, but somehow Brian found out. At a family barbecue the weekend before my interview, he announced it to everyone. "Maggie's got a big job interview coming up," he said with a smirk. "Hope your nerves don't get the better of you." My face burned with embarrassment. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Loud, mocking, and just enough to make everyone question me, including myself. I didn't get the job. I'll never know if his comment played a role, but it still hurt. When I confronted him afterward, he brushed it off with a laugh. "Relax, Maggie," he said, dismissively. "I was just joking. You need to lighten up." As always, Mom came to his defense. "Brian didn't mean anything by it," she said, her tone firm. "You're too sensitive sometimes. Too sensitive." That's what they always called me whenever I reacted to Brian's behavior. Sensitive, uptight, dramatic. Those labels became scars, reminders of every time I tried to stand up for myself and was told to sit back down. But as I paced around my apartment that morning, something inside me shifted. I didn't feel like backing down anymore. I grabbed my phone and opened the family group chat. It was the usual banter, mostly from Brian. He'd even sent a meme about overthinking, clearly another jab at me. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard before I finally typed, "Brian, that comment wasn't funny. It was out of line." I hit send before I could overthink it. His reply came almost instantly. "Relax, Maggie. It's not that serious." The group chat went silent. I could almost feel the discomfort radiating through the screen. Brian wasn't used to me calling him out, and my response clearly caught him off guard. But unsurprisingly, he didn't take it seriously. Later that day, my phone rang. It was Mom, and her voice had that familiar tone of frustration, the one she used whenever she thought I was overreacting. "Maggie, can't you just let this go?" she asked. "You know how Brian is." For once, I didn't argue or try to defend myself. Instead, I said, "I'm not letting it go this time, Mom." The silence on her end told me she wasn't expecting that. She started to respond, but I cut her off. "I've let it go too many times," I said firmly. "This time, I'm standing up for myself." After a long pause, she muttered something about not wanting drama and ended the call. A few days later, I found out there was another family dinner planned, this time at Aunt Karen's house in Dayton. It was one of those big get-togethers where everyone showed up. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and even family friends. These events were Brian's stage. He'd charm the crowd, make everyone laugh, and leave them talking about how fun and easygoing he was. But this time, I saw it as an opportunity. If Brian wanted to play his usual games, I'd make sure the rules were different. Before the dinner, Dad pulled me aside during a visit to my parents' house. Dad rarely got involved in family drama, so what he said next surprised me. "Maggie," he began quietly, "you're not wrong to call Brian out. He's gotten away with too much for years." I stared at him, shocked. Dad had never openly acknowledged the dynamic before, let alone taken my side. "I didn't say anything before because I didn't want to cause tension," he admitted. "But I'll back you up if things get out of hand." Hearing that gave me a sense of relief. For once, I wouldn't feel completely alone in this. Meanwhile, Brian was being his usual self. My cousin Kelly told me he'd been joking about me behind my back. "She's on a power trip," he'd said. "She'll cool off eventually." He wasn't taking me seriously, but that only strengthened my resolve. I stopped engaging with him altogether, No sarcastic comebacks, no frustrated replies, just silence. It clearly unsettled him. At one casual family meetup, he tried to bait me with a snide comment about how I was too busy for the family group chat. I smiled politely and walked away. His smug expression faltered, but he didn't press further. The night of Aunt Karen's dinner finally arrived, and I was ready. The house buzzed with laughter and chatter as everyone caught up. Brian was in his element, surrounded by cousins and family friends, cracking jokes and rehashing old stories, conveniently leaving out his own mistakes. I kept my distance, chatting with Kelly and a few other relatives who had always supported me. At one point, Kelly leaned in and whispered, "You okay?" "You seem quieter than usual." I nodded and gave her a small smile. "Just waiting for the right moment." Eventually, we all sat down for dinner. The table was packed with roasted chicken, green beans, and cornbread. Family gatherings like this had always been a mix of nostalgia and chaos, the older relatives reminiscing about the past, the younger ones sneaking glances at their phone gnomes to avoid getting caught. At some point, the conversation naturally shifted to funny family stories. Brian, of course, seized the spotlight. He launched into a tale about a childhood trip to Myrtle Beach. As he spoke, I could feel his eyes flicking toward me occasionally, like he was testing the waters. Then he said it. "You know, Maggie's always been the serious one." He began with a grin, his voice loud enough to draw everyone's attention. "Even when we were kids, she was like a little adult, always worrying about everything." The table erupted in laughter, but I felt the familiar sting of humiliation. Brian had a talent for stealing the spotlight and turning it into a subtle jab aimed at me. I took a deep breath, deciding it was time to address it. "Hey, Brian," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Remember when you said I overthink everything at the last dinner? What exactly did you mean by that?" The room went silent, and all eyes shifted toward him. Brian blinked, clearly caught off guard. "It was just a joke, Maggie," he said, laughing nervously. "You're not still hung up on that, are you?" "Hung up on it?" I replied, keeping my tone calm. "You made a personal remark in front of everyone. I just want to know if you think it's acceptable to make jokes at someone else's expense." The tension in the room was palpable. Brian shifted awkwardly in his chair, his confidence visibly shaken. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered. Mom, sitting to my left, tried to intervene. "Maggie, let's not do this here. It's a family dinner." I turned to her, my tone still controlled but firm. "Mom, I'm tired of letting things slide. Brian has been making comments like this for years, and every time I'm told to just ignore it. Why is that?" For a moment, no one spoke. Some of my cousins exchanged uneasy glances, while Kelly, sitting across from me, gave a small nod of support. Brian finally mumbled an insincere apology. "Sorry if I upset you. I didn't mean to." I could tell he didn't mean it. His tone was dismissive, and he avoided eye contact. Still, it was a small step forward. "Thank you," I said simply, though I wasn't satisfied. The conversation moved on awkwardly, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. For the first time, Brian had been called out in front of the family, and it was obvious he didn't know how to respond. The next morning, my phone rang. It was Mom, and she wasted no time diving into her usual lecture. "Maggie, you embarrassed Brian in front of everyone," she said sharply. "You know how he is. Why couldn't you just let it go?" Even though frustration bubbled inside me, I kept my composure. "Mom, why is it always my responsibility to keep the peace? Why am I always expected to be the bigger person?" "Because you're stronger than he is," she replied, as if that justified everything. "Brian's going through a lot right now. He doesn't need more stress." "And what about me?" I asked. "Does what I'm going through not matter? Or does it only matter when Brian feels uncomfortable?" She had no response to that. After a brief silence, she sighed. "We'll talk about this later," she said, before hanging up. Over the next few days, the fallout from the dinner became evident. Brian began spinning his own version of events, portraying himself as the victim and me as the troublemaker. Relatives started reaching out, cautiously asking, "What's going on with you and Brian?" As though I were the one causing the tension. I explained the situation calmly each time, sticking to the facts. I wasn't looking to start fights, but I also wasn't going to let Brian's behavior slide anymore. To my surprise, some relatives admitted they had noticed Brian's pattern of dodging responsibility or making hurtful comments, but had stayed quiet to avoid conflict. My cousin Kelly, as always, had my back. Over coffee one morning, she offered words of encouragement. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "It's tough, but it's about time someone stood up to him. Whether people admit it or not, they're starting to see Brian for who he really is." Her support gave me a glimmer of hope that the family dynamic might finally be shifting. Then something unexpected happened. During a casual family meetup, Dad, who usually stayed out of these conflicts, spoke up. Someone made an offhand comment about the tension in the family, and before I could respond, Dad calmly said, "Brian's behavior has been unacceptable for years. Maggie was right to call him out." The room fell silent. Brian froze, looking like he'd been slapped. Mom tried to laugh it off, but Dad didn't let it slide. "It's time we stop pretending this isn't a problem," he said firmly. For the first time, I felt like someone was truly in my corner. Brian stormed out, muttering angrily under his breath, and Mom followed him, leaving the rest of us in uncomfortable silence. But I didn't care. I wasn't alone anymore. That moment felt like the first crack in Brian's golden image. In the following week, the fallout spread further. Brian wasn't one to suffer in silence. He made sure everyone knew how unfairly he was being treated, casting himself as the victim and accusing me of creating unnecessary drama. Cousins, aunts, and uncles reached out cautiously, their tones hesitant. "What's going on with you and Brian?" they'd ask, as though I were the source of the problem. I explained calmly each time, sticking to the truth. I wasn't interested in stirring the pot, but was determined to stop letting Brian's behavior go unchecked. Some relatives surprised me by admitting they'd noticed Brian's behavior for years, but hadn't spoken up to keep the peace. Kelly remained a constant source of support, reassuring me whenever Brian's narrative seemed to gain traction. "You're doing the right thing," she told me firmly. "It's tough, but it's time someone stood up to him. People are starting to see the real Brian, even if they won't say it out loud." Not everyone sided with me, though. Mom was furious. She called me nearly every day, alternating between pleading and scolding. "Maggie, you're tearing this family apart," she said during one call. "Brian's under so much stress already, and you're making it worse." "I'm not tearing the family apart, Mom," I replied calmly. "Brian's actions are. If you'd held him accountable years ago, we wouldn't be in this situation now." "That's not fair," she snapped. "No, Mom," I said firmly. "What's not fair is how you've spent years keeping Brian comfortable, while the rest of us paid the price." She hung up, clearly upset, but I didn't feel guilty. For the first time, I was speaking the truth I'd held inside for years, and I wasn't about to apologize for it. Meanwhile, Brian was escalating. Brian started posting vague, passive-aggressive updates on social media. Those kinds of posts clearly crafted to draw sympathy without mentioning names. One of them read, "Crazy how some people twist the truth to make themselves look good. Family is supposed to stick together, not tear each other apart." His friends and acquaintances, most of whom had no idea what was really happening, flooded the comments with supportive messages. "Stay strong, Brian," and "You're better than that drama," or "Family can be the worst sometimes." It was infuriating, but I refused to engage. Then the family group chat erupted. Brian posted a snide comment, clearly directed at me. "Some people just can't move on from the past. Holding grudges only makes things worse." I chose not to reply, but my silence didn't stop the escalating drama. To my surprise, Dad stepped in. "Brian," he wrote, "this needs to stop. We've ignored these issues for too long, and it's time to address them. You owe Maggie and the rest of the family an apology." The chat exploded. Brian immediately fired back, accusing Dad of favoritism and claiming he'd always felt like the outcast in the family. It was a ridiculous claim, especially considering how much Mom had coddled him over the years. But Brian leaned hard into his victim narrative, milking it for all it was worth. A few relatives chimed in, some defending Brian, others trying to defuse the situation. Meanwhile, I started getting private messages from family members expressing their support or sharing their own frustrations about Brian's behavior. One cousin texted, "Honestly, Maggie, it's about time someone stood up to him. He's been getting away with way too much for years." At our next family gathering, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Conversations felt forced, and people avoided eye contact whenever Brian or I entered the room. Brian sat off to the side, uncharacteristically quiet, while Mom flitted about, nervously trying to maintain a cheerful facade. But the real turning point came when Aunt Diane, who had always been one of Brian's most vocal defenders, finally spoke up. Brian was mid-story about how he was constantly misunderstood when Aunt Diane interrupted him, her tone calm but firm. "You know, Brian, it seems like you misunderstand people an awful lot. Funny how it always seems to end with you playing the victim." The room fell silent. Brian's face turned red, and for a moment, he looked genuinely flustered. He mumbled something about not wanting to argue and stormed out of the room. That moment seemed to open the floodgates. Relatives who had stayed silent for years started speaking up, sharing their own stories about Brian. One cousin mentioned how Brian had borrowed money and never paid it back. An uncle recounted how Brian bailed on helping with a family event, leaving him scrambling at the last minute. It was as if everyone had been waiting for permission to air their grievances, and now that the ice had been broken, they couldn't stop. Even Mom seemed shaken. I overheard her quietly telling Brian after the dinner, "Maybe it's time you start thinking about how your actions affect others." For once, she sounded tired, not just from the conflict, but from years of constantly defending him. As for me, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. This wasn't just about Brian anymore. The family was finally acknowledging what I had endured for years and beginning to hold him accountable. But Brian wasn't ready to back down. A week later, he hosted a small gathering with family friends. From what I heard, he used the opportunity to air his grievances, painting me as bitter and jealous, claiming I was out to punish him without cause. Some family friends even called me afterward, asking what was going on. Calmly, I explained my side, making it clear that I wasn't interested in smearing Brian's name, but was standing up for myself after years of being dismissed. "He's not used to being called out," I told them. "And that's exactly why it's happening now." It felt like a pivotal moment. The cracks in Brian's image as the golden child were becoming more visible, and for the first time, others were noticing. The breaking point came when Brian demanded a family meeting. He insisted it was time to fix the drama and set things straight. But I knew better. This wasn't about resolution. It was about him trying to regain control of the narrative. Mom, predictably, supported the idea. "We need to come together as a family," she said during one of her frequent calls. "Maggie, can't you just try to meet him halfway?" "I'll come," I told her, "but only if Brian offers a genuine apology, not another half-hearted, 'I'm sorry if you were hurt.' He needs to take responsibility." She hesitated but eventually agreed, probably assuming I'd cave under pressure. The meeting was set for a Sunday afternoon at Mom and Dad's house. I walked in feeling a mixture of nerves and determination. The living room was crowded, with relatives perched on couches and folding chairs, while Mom bustled nervously, trying to maintain a light atmosphere. Dad sat quietly in a corner, observing. Brian, meanwhile, was seated at the head of the room, arms crossed, his expression defiant. He didn't look like someone ready to apologize. He looked like someone preparing to double down on his narrative. Once everyone had settled, Brian wasted no time launching into his speech. "This whole situation has gotten out of control," he began, his voice dripping with practiced confidence. "I feel like I'm being attacked for no reason. I've always tried to be there for this family, but lately it feels like I'm being scapegoated. I clenched my fists, but kept my expression neutral." Brian continued, throwing in jabs about how he'd always felt like the black sheep, even accusing Dad of favoring me. When he finally finished, the room was silent, his words hanging heavily in the air. All eyes turned to me. This was my moment. I stood up and took a deep breath. "Brian," I said, "let's talk about what's really happening here. This isn't about you being attacked. It's about your actions and how they've affected the rest of us." I began listing incidents one by one. The science project he ruined, the job interview he sabotaged, and the countless times he shirked responsibility while the rest of us picked up the slack. He avoided responsibilities, leaving others to deal with the consequences. I didn't raise my voice or get emotional. I just presented the facts, each one landing heavier than the last. By the time I finished, Brian appeared noticeably uneasy, his usual confidence replaced by an awkward silence. To my surprise, other family members began speaking up. Kelly was the first. She recounted how Brian had borrowed money from her and never returned it. "Every time I asked you about it, you'd laugh it off like it didn't matter," she said, her tone steady but firm. Then Uncle Ray chimed in, describing how Brian had backed out of helping with a family reunion, leaving him scrambling to manage everything at the last moment. As more relatives shared their stories, Brian's expression shifted from defiance to unease. His charm, the skill he always used to control the narrative, wasn't working this time. Even Mom, who had remained silent until now, looked visibly unsettled. When she finally spoke, her voice was trembling. "I thought I was keeping the peace by asking Maggie to let things go," she said. "But now I see that I was just enabling you, Brian. I didn't want to admit it, but I've been unfair." It wasn't a complete apology, but it was the closest she had ever come to acknowledging her mistakes. Under the weight of everyone's stories and Mom's reluctant admission, Brian finally cracked. He slumped in his chair, rubbing his hands over his face. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Sorry for what?" I asked, refusing to let him off the hook so easily. He looked up at me, frustration evident in his eyes, but for the first time, so was genuine remorse. "I'm sorry for making jokes at your expense. I'm sorry for avoiding responsibility. And I'm sorry for hurting you and everyone else. It wasn't perfect, but it felt sincere." For once, Brian wasn't trying to charm his way out of trouble or shift the blame. He was owning up to his actions, even if only partially. I nodded, keeping my voice even. "Thank you for apologizing, Brian, but words alone aren't enough. If you're serious about making things right, it'll take action. Not just apologies." He nodded, his face flushed. "I know. I'll do better," he said quietly. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice small but meaningful changes. Brian apologized to Kelly and worked out a plan to repay the money he owed her. He volunteered to help Uncle Ray with an upcoming family gathering, arriving early to pitch in. He even reached out to me in private, offering another apology, this time with no audience and no pressure. For once, his efforts seemed genuine. The family dynamic began to shift as well. Relatives who had stayed silent for years started holding Brian accountable. When he tried to deflect blame or make excuses, they gently but firmly called him out. Even Mom made an effort to stop defending him. She apologized to me for brushing off my feelings in the past and began treating me with more respect. Dad remained his usual quiet but steady self, subtly encouraging Brian to continue taking steps toward amending his behavior. Things aren't perfect, and they likely never will be. But for the first time, there's a sense of fairness in our family. I no longer feel like the sole person responsible for keeping the peace, and Brian is finally learning what it means to own up to his actions. The once impenetrable armor of the golden child has cracked. It's taken years to reach this point, but I finally feel like we're making progress. It's not the resolution I anticipated, but it's one I can accept. And for the first time in my life, that feels like a victory.